Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jason Thistlethwaite on the issue of sustainability reporting. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or international relations. Today, my guest is Dr. Jason Thistlethwaite. He is an assistant professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo and fellow here at CIGI. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
To get started, for our audience who may not be familiar with the term, what is sustainability reporting or sustainability disclosure?
Sure. So a sustainability report is a way for a company to measure and communicate its environmental, social, and governance performance, and record that in a way that then can be understood and used by stakeholders external to the firm.
Okay, and what is the main purpose of the reporting for these companies?
It depends on the audience you ask.
Okay.
But historically, sustainability reporting emerged primarily as an accountability mechanism for a firm's environmental performance. The idea being that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So the more transparency you offer on a firm, the more that external stakeholders can, such as civil society, governments, investors, can look at that information and then make an assessment on whether or not they should be supporting the company by buying its products, or more substantially, whether they should be investing in a company.
Okay. And the Financial Stability Board has started to pay attention to this idea. Could you say a little bit about what the Financial Stability Board is and then why it might be interested in an issue like this?
Sure. So from my perspective, the Financial Stability Board is really the global governor of the financial system. It oversees a number of different financial standard setters that really make the rules and regulations that shape international financial governance. Why it's interested in this particular issue, I think is quite fascinating to me. I've been looking at this discussion around the measurement of sustainability, climate change as it relates to company performance for, almost a decade now, actually. It seems like such a long time. And for the most part, this discussion was being had amongst sort of a group of marginal and interested NGOs, academics. CIGI was having this discussion. And then in 2014, the governor of the Bank of England, right, and the head of the Financial Stability Board, Mark Carney, delivered a speech where he articulated that the financial industry needs to do a much better job in understanding the risks associated with climate change. And he made a particularly compelling argument around a concept known as the tragedy of the horizons. The idea that there is no incentive in the short term for financial markets to assess and manage these costs of climate change because the time horizon that these markets operate on is too short. And so these costs are over the horizon of where they ought to be. The Financial Stability Board has a mandate to ensure the stability of financial markets. And one of the key ways it can do that is through informing how financial markets and publicly listed companies measure and disclose information related to climate change risk. So the task force is the first step in the Financial Stability Board developing a set of advice, standards. We don't even know what the output is likely to be, but hopefully it's a standardized and common approach to the measurement and disclosure of these climate change risks that investors need more information on.
Now, the FSB has recently come out and said that it wants the G20 to play a role in this and the idea of a G20 disclosure task force. What role can the G20 play in reporting on sustainability, and has it showed any enthusiasm for taking this on?
I'm sure if I was someone working on the high macroeconomic issues that the G20 focuses on, someone coming up to me and saying, maybe you should be paying attention to this climate change risk issue, it would come as somewhat a surprise. So the FSB here is operating in a way that I'd say is quite refreshing, progressive, but also prudently, in the sense that it's recognized that the same types of risks that led to the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, fundamentally related to a mispricing of risk in the housing, mortgage, and credit markets, could occur again as a consequence of us not accurately measuring the exposure of the economy to climate change risk. If it's framed in that way to the G20, I think there's going to be some level of receptivity. Compared to the way that the FSB, before the G20 existed, I mean, this is an interesting discussion actually, because I actually think that it's be more beneficial that the G20 has a role in this than some countries like the G8. And that's because a lot of the countries that are more significant emerging economies that are involved in G20 actually have a much more rigorous approach to sustainability reporting than developed counterparts.
Okay. Right.
So you may actually be drawing upon some of the expertise from these countries who have practiced this and implemented these strategies in the past. So I think as an issue to the broad base of the G20, particularly let's call it the G8 component of it, right. This issue may be a little bit more of an unconventional topic to be discussing. But to some of the emerging economies that are involved in the G20, this might be an area of more comfort for them and an area that they may be more willing to lend a voice to. So that could be something that's positive.
Okay. And perhaps just building on this, I mean, one of, I think, the challenges that we encounter in all areas of global governance is a lack of enforcement capacity. If a system of reporting is put into place, how could the G20 or the FSB essentially enforce compliance so that people are all contributing to the system or playing by the same rules?
This is arguably the most significant challenge that sustainability reporting has to overcome. For the most part, sustainability reporting has been voluntary. This leads to the problem of forum shopping, whereby companies can pick and choose more or less what they'd like to, the information they'd like to shine some sunlight onto, right? So it could make them look quite good. They can also shop different standards. So they can find a particular standard of measurement that they feel is most aligned with their interests. Mainstream financial reporting standards are enforced in a much more rigorous way. It requires a third-party auditor to look at whether or not you are complying with the specific type of information requested by the standard. And if you are not in compliance with that type of standard, you could suffer a fine. And any type of intervention by, let's say, a group like the Securities and Exchange Commission, for instance,
right.
On a firm that has inadequately failed to disclose certain information is a real black eye, because investors are going to look at that firm and say, why would I trust my investment in this firm when I'm actually not getting the information I need to make the right type of decision? The FSB, G20, are they the right authorities to be developing a type of enforcement mechanism to try and improve climate change risk disclosure? I think that'll be tough for those types of institutions. Probably the most pragmatic approach would probably be to leave it up to domestic financial regulators. Okay. I think that would be a strong way to go about doing things. The more likely outcome, though, is the way that sustainability reporting is more or less done all along. And the strongest enforcement mechanism, theoretically, should be the market. Okay. So if firms do adequately disclose their information, and it'll be comparable across different sectors, different firms, investors will then be able to make a decision for themselves on how they punish or reward firms based on their exposure to something like climate change risk.
And perhaps on that note, how is the private sector responding to this idea of sustainability reporting or disclosure, recognizing that the private sector is a pretty big player in all of this?
Imagine I'm the Canada Revenue Agency and I knock on your door,
right,
and I say, Doctor, I'd like a lot more information about how you spend your money and your finances. You need to change how you're measuring these finances, and you need to spend likely more additional time collecting information and putting it into these reports. You may also have to actually go out and hire another accountant or some other people to actually look at this. It's going to take more resources.
Okay.
And so for the most part, just like an individual being asked to provide more information on a survey or something, they're quite reluctant to do it, and that can lead to opposition. And there are certain parts of the private sector that are obviously going to oppose something like this more than other sectors. If you're in the renewable economy, you're a green firm, you're have good sustainability practices, sure, no problem. This stuff is already embedded in your corporate DNA.
Right.
If you're in the oil and gas sector, you're in a part of the economy that is quite carbon intense. The news that comes out as a consequence of you complying with this report may not be that welcome, and it may send a signal to investors that they should be a little bit more nervous about the long-term prospects of the firm. So that'd be another layer of opposition. Another significant concern is liability.
Okay.
So that if you do disclose and you make a mistake on how you disclose, you could be exposed to regulators or lawsuits saying that you measured this inadequately. And that's a big challenge that all regulators have to deal with. The G20 and the FSB are going to have to deal with, because there's a balance between flexibility in reporting and ensuring that you reduce the type of uncertainty that is inherent to an issue like climate change or the environment.
Right. And just to wrap up, though, how important is this kind of system of disclosure to the larger effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and eventually move to a post-carbon economy?
Speaking from the perspective of an investor, and let's say a concerned investor, someone who's aware of these types of issues, I think it's a very strong and important first step. We need to know first how to measure this stuff in order to better know how to allocate our resources in a way that can produce those types of low carbon outcomes that we need to meet our greenhouse gas emission targets.
Right.
The big risk is this idea around stranded assets, and that without this information, you could see a situation where governments come in, they start regulating the price of greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, and so the costs of operating in a greenhouse gas intensive sector, such as the oil and gas industry, increase significantly to the point where their liabilities related to these costs exceed the potential return on that investment. You could see investors, as they are wont to do, act like a herd and pull their money out of these parts of the economy, leaving these assets stranded and creating a significant liability for the countries and companies that hold them. So improving transparency through something like climate change risk disclosure is the first step in easing a transition towards understanding where we should be putting our money to make the most returns for not only the financial sector, but the economy more broadly.
And are you hopeful we'll figure this out?
I have been pleasantly surprised at how much progress and momentum has gone into this issue since I started doing my research almost a decade ago. As I said, it very much started as sort of a fringe, almost radical idea that the financial industry would be taking a look at sort of these environmental and sustainability issues and taking them seriously. But now we have the governor of the Bank of England, the head of the global governor of the financial sector, putting together a task force to try and address this type of issue. So I'm more optimistic than I ever have been as a consequence of the priority around it. That being said, the challenge for the FSB and these groups is going to be tremendous. There's over 400 existing different standards and ways that you can measure something like climate change risk in the financial sector. And they're going to be the ones that has to sit down and figure out what would be the one common approach to do this.
Right, right. Jason, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you to our audience. Please join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues. You can find us online at cgionline.org, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jason Thistlethwaite on the issue of sustainability reporting. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science.
To measure and communicate its environmental, social, and governance performance, and record that in a way that then can be understood and used by stakeholders external to the firm.
Okay, and what is the main purpose at the University of Waterloo and fellow here at CIGI? Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
To get started, for our audience who may not be familiar with the term, what is sustainability reporting or sustainability disclosure?
Sure. So a sustainability report is a way for a company
at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or international relations. Today, my guest is Dr. Jason Thistlethwaite. He is an assistant professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development